then you don't need to give yourself an unrealistic goal. I think the idea is that you give yourself a goal or a benchmark that will make your crafting fun and focused. Hi, my name is Mark and welcome to the channel. Today I'm coming to you with a sort of challenge to myself, and that is to knit a sweater in a week's time. Now, if you've been here on the channel before, you know I love to knit sweaters. You know I have several sweaters, and you might think that I'm a pretty fast knitter. I'm definitely not among the fastest out there in the world, but I like to give myself goals. I like to have something pushing me to work on a project, and I like the rush of finishing it fairly quickly. So this week is all about tracking my progress with making a sweater. Now, I don't know that I'll exactly finish it in a week. Stick around to figure out if that happens or not, but we'll break down the progress. We'll be breaking down my pacing for working on a garment, talking about what I do to keep myself focused, different benchmarks that I look forward to during the process, and other things that come up during this knitting challenge. So if you'd like to spend a little bit of time with me, and Gus, I guess, stick around and let's get into it. Let me start by addressing why the challenge. I like to give myself goals. I find that if I give myself some sort of expectation, no matter how big or small that expectation is, I'm much more likely to finish the task and enjoy working on it. I also enjoy videos where people do things like this. I like to see the expectation set and see how everything unfolds, whether or not they reach that goal. So I enjoy watching TikToks, YouTube videos, anyone else who's doing any sort of challenge, whether it's baking something, sewing something, knitting or crocheting something. So I thought, this is what I'm always doing in my mind, so let me share it with you here on the channel. A final point for giving myself a tighter goal, like finishing a sweater in a week, is that I'll get to enjoy the sweater sooner. So when I started knitting, it was about 2 weeks ago before filming this video, and I wanted to work on the sweater so that I could hopefully wear it while we still have a little bit of cold weather. So that's the other reason here. Now, I'll say before we go any further, I don't think knitting or crocheting should be a race. I don't think the point of crafting should be that you can do it quickly. I think that it's slow fashion. If I'm making a sweater, it's taking me days and days, if not weeks and weeks, if not months and months. So if you're coming along with me in this video, please don't think that there's any expectation that you should be churning out or racing to finish projects. Now, realistically, we all have deadlines of some sort, whether it's making something before we grow out of it, making something for someone's birthday or for a holiday, but that's not what it's about. This is slow fashion. When I make a sweater, I spend a lot of time choosing the pattern, even more time choosing the yarn, and then way more time actually knitting it and doing the finishing work. So please keep in mind during the video, I don't think knitting should be a race. I don't think speed is what it's about. I just wanted to track my process of making this sweater and really charting out what happens each day of the journey. So we'll be breaking this down into days. Each day I'll show my progress, I'll show what's going on behind the scenes, my thought process, just anything going on with the sweater. And in that, you'll see that not every day is built the same. There are some days where I get to knit a lot, or I end up knitting a lot, whether I really planned it or not. And then there are days where I don't really do much. And I'm sure that's realistic for anyone watching. Our schedules are built very differently, our lives are built differently, and who knows how much time you can consistently work on your crafts. So that's definitely an element that comes up in this progress video. And then there will be some highs and lows. There will be some great things that happen along the way, and of course some things that are frustrating, maybe things I have to redo, or things that I might be disappointed with, because nothing is ever really a perfect project. Mistakes are made, frustrations are had, so we'll see what happens during this week. All right, let's jump in to day one. So truly, we need to check in before day one even starts, and that's a bit of our prep work. So here we're going to choose a pattern, we're going to settle on the yarn, and then we're going to check our gauge. Once we have those three things determined and we know that we're confident with at least the general trajectory or starting trajectory of the project, then we can get started. Now, you can always wing it. You can just jump in and try without testing gauge or testing, swatching, considering different types of yarn. But for me, I want the fit of the sweater to work out mostly as I envision. And I don't know, I like to take the time to test these things. So first, let's talk the pattern. Ideally, I want to make a traditional sort of Gansey sweater, and I did reference some historic Gansey books and sources, and then I did a search for current patterns, things with maybe a slightly more modern fit or construction that honor some of the texture and some of that history. So I'm not doing gusted on underarms. I'm not making a historically accurate reproduction of a Gansey, but I want the general feel, the general vibe of a Gansey sweater. So I'm going with a petite knit pattern. It's the Storm sweater. And I do my pattern searches on Ravelry. I look for 5-star rated patterns. I look for things that other people have done. I want to see project examples. I want to see different colors. I want to see different yarns. And I want to make sure it's highly rated. I don't want to work a pattern that has mistakes for me to stumble upon. I want to do something that seems fairly trustworthy, and I often like a modern construction. So this is one of the few Gansey sweaters that comes up when I filter my search for 5-star rated patterns that are accessible for me to download and pay for the single file without having to buy a book and dig through the book and maybe go about it in that direction. So I totally understand this may not be everyone's preference. You may want something that's more historically accurate. You may have other designers you like, or you might just want to design something for yourself. But for me, I like to do that sort of filtered search to start myself off on the right foot. Now let's take a look at the yarn and talk about swatching for the project. So initially I was looking at Scout from Kelborn Woolens or Woolstok from Blue Sky Fibers, both of which are sold at the local yarn shop Around the Table Yarns where I work in Shaker Heights, Ohio. So typically I'm using yarn that I can get at my local shop because that's where I work. I want to shop as local as I can. So this was the first test, and this was a swatch made from Kelborn Woolens Scout, which is a DK weight wool. And my findings from this swatch were that I can't quite see the textured pattern as much as I want. And also I think the fabric is a little loose. I think if I had gone with this fiber, I would need to go down a needle size or two to get the fabric that I desire. So that was my initial swatch. Then I moved over to Woolstok. Now Woolstok is a worsted weight yarn, so I thought using the same size needle, I might get a slightly more dense fabric, which I think I did. You'll see this here is a more firm, dense fabric. It's not as holey or see-through as the Scout, because this is worsted, this is DK. I also found that I could see the pattern pretty well. Granted, this is a baby swatch. I did my more generous swatch here, so I didn't want to do the exact same thing. I just wanted enough to see if I liked the density of the fabric and if I could see the pattern a little more clearly. And then just to be sure, I swatched another baby swatch out of a different color of Woolstok, and that's here. I lose the pattern a bit here with this darker shade. So then my answer was this. I'm going to sub out a worsted weight yarn. I'll use Woolstok. I like using Woolstok. I like the way it wears. The sweater I'm wearing now is Woolstok. So that's the decision. That's how I got there. And now I'm ready to wind up that yarn and get started on the sweater. The last thing to consider in this prep work is to make sure I have all of the supplies that I might need for the project. So that's looking at the needle sizes, making sure that I'm happy with those needle sizes after my swatching. And then I use interchangeable needles, so I want to make sure I have all of the cord lengths needed. If you use fixed needles, you need to make sure you have all the different sizes needed. And then other supplies that I might need. I like to print my patterns. I like to use things like highlighter tape. I like to have a tape measure, a darning needle, and a variety of stitch markers to use along the way to keep track of measurements, to keep track of pattern, stitches, anything I need. So I gather all of that, and then I'm ready to technically start day one of the sweater. Now, truly for day one, I'm taking this sweater with me on a trip to Tucson, Arizona, where I'll be singing for the week with True Concord Voices and Orchestra. And because this is a travel week, it gives me a variety of knitting days. Some days I'll have a lot of time. Those are the days with flights where I'm sitting in an airport, where I have a lot of time on a flight to knit. There are also days where I'm going to have hours and hours of rehearsal and other work that I need to keep up with during the day, so I might not get to knit as much. And we'll break that down as we go through the rest of the week. So starting day one, we are at the airport in Cleveland where I get to cast on my project. I always like to cast on before I actually get on the plane, just in case there are any issues I run into. I want to make sure I have all my supplies out. I'm not going to be making silly mistakes from the start. Once I've cast on and I've established that initial rhythm of the pattern, then I'm happy to get on the plane and hopefully knock out as much as I can of that initial knitting on the travel day. In this airport clip, I look a little bit grumpy. It's probably because I'm in an airport. I'm a little stressed. I always get anxious about travel and timetables, things getting delayed. You just don't know what's going to happen. So I'm happy on the inside. It's just how I look on the outside. So I'm casting on in the airport, getting all set for the project. And I will say that knitting in an airport and on an airplane, something about that very public crafting keeps me engaged. It keeps me focused. I'm not likely to put down my project and check my phone or get distracted. I want to keep knitting. I kind of want to show the people that might be watching me craft that I'm actually making progress. Not that it's like a big performance, but something about knitting in public keeps me very focused and very determined to actually make some progress. So it's one of my happiest places to knit. Now that we're on the plane, I'm watching episodes of Murder, She Wrote. More on that maybe in a future episode. And I'm in my happy place. I have a show going, I have my noise canceling headphones in, I've got apple juice or ginger ale, something to sip on, and I'm knitting. And it's pretty uninterrupted because we're on a moving plane and nobody really needs to interrupt me unless they want to touch my yarn. So, again, I'm always excited to start a project when I'm on a flight because what else am I going to do on that plane ride? We had a long travel day and we landed pretty close to midnight out in Tucson, and I had to wait for our baggage. It took a while. It was late at night, and so I got my knitting out and I got to work on a little bit more before getting in the rental car and going to bed for the night. So this is my progress for day one of the storm sweater. Now for day two of the sweater. I started my day in a very envious situation, which was poolside knitting in Tucson. So it's winter in Cleveland, but in Tucson, it's beautiful, it's warm. So as much as I can, I'm going to sit by the pool, sit somewhere with a view, and knit. Today, I picked up the shoulders of the project and started to work my way towards the neckline and then attempt to get as far as I could towards the underarms where the body would join in the round. Something I do with every project is have some sort of benchmark or a series of benchmarks in place that keep me excited and engaged with my project. So with a top-down sweater, I'm excited to work until the point where I split the sleeves off and work the body in the round. For a sweater like this that starts with a back panel piece, I'm excited to finish that back panel, work the shoulders. The next benchmark is joining the neckline, so that's what I got to do today. And then after that, it's going to be working until I hit the underarm where I can join the body in the round. So I didn't get quite that far today, but that's the goal in mind. Ned and I also performed at a season announcement party today for True Concord, so that was another event in the day that interrupted, I should say, a little bit of my knitting. That's how my mind works. Any other work I have to do is just an interruption to my knitting time, right? Before we left the season announcement party, we went to look at the sun setting, and then I took a clip of one of these rooms that looks like heaven to me. I mean, this is what I want for retirement, somewhere beautiful to sit and knit, be peaceful. So that's my dream. Now for day three of this sweater progress. So today I'm starting again by the pool, a beautiful place to be, enviable, I know. I wish it were what I could do every day, but I get to do it sometimes, which is always enjoyable. So I'm working by the pool, continuing working across flat front and back, the front of the sweater, to reach that underarm point. And at this point, I'm able to try the sweater on, join those places, and see if there's enough depth. I'm always really excited to join in the round because it means I'm working the right side of the project. There's no more turning back and forth, which means the pattern is easier for me to see. Excuse me, the pattern is easier for me to see. It's easier for me to work and read my knitting. I can memorize the pattern more easily at that point, which means I can knit a bit faster. Once I've reached that point and I've joined the sweater under the arms, I can try it on, which is always a great moment to see if the armhole depth is adequate, if the fit is working out as planned, and if I need to make any major adjustments. Now for day 4. Day 4 started with a sunrise. So I got up early. I always tell myself I'm going to get up early in Tucson and watch the sunrise. It doesn't always happen. I normally want to stay in bed and sleep a little bit more, but this morning I was able to successfully get up early and go over to Tumamoc Hill, where I walked up, found a good resting spot, and excuse me, and could watch the sunrise. So I took my camera along, I took my project, and I was able to get probably a good 30 to 45 minutes of knitting done now on the body of the sweater. On the evening of day 4, we had our first rehearsal with the orchestra for the project, which means some of the rehearsal time is now split for orchestral things, which means I get to knit even more. So I have a little clip here of knitting with the orchestra, and I'll pause for a moment so you can hear a snippet of their music. And now for a pacing check-in. I already talked about the initial benchmarks of starting the project, being excited for something new, and working towards sort of the underarms if it's a top-down sweater. That's a great moment to join the sweater, try it on, and then, like I said, I can work on the right side of things, which I think speeds up my knitting and makes the project start to go by faster. After that, the remaining portion of the body, the torso, always seems sluggish. It's a lot of knitting for me. I've got a lot of torso, both in width and length, so I have a lot to knit, and this part can often feel never ending. And to battle that, to counteract that, I usually like to do things like take my knitting with me somewhere special, like taking it to watch the sunrise, maybe knitting somewhere else in public, getting together with friends and working on the project while everyone is hanging out, visiting, or if I'm by myself, I like to put on a show or a movie to help pass that time. So I tried to do all of those things on this trip. I watched the sunrise, I took the project to rehearsals, I took it to restaurants, and I would stay up late and watch movies, watch things on TV to keep me a little bit distracted from maybe how monotonous the project becomes. Now for day 5. I don't think I have much footage of day 5. This was a rehearsal day in Green Valley, which is not too far from Tucson, but we spend a little bit of time in the car getting to Green Valley for rehearsal and then getting home afterwards. So I did less knitting. Not much progress to show, but I will say at the end of this day, I ended up staying up really late. I just couldn't stop knitting, and that leads us into day 6, and we'll see some of that progress. Now for day 6, as a result of me staying up till about 4:30 a.m., knitting, just because I couldn't stop, I said, let me knit another 3 rows. Let me knit to the end of this textured section. Let me work to the next section. If I stay up and keep knitting, then the sweater will be done sooner. So it's like, oh, sometimes I stay up too late and then I can't sleep, and instead of tossing and turning, I'd rather be knitting. So that's what I did. I sacrificed a bit of sleep to keep knitting, which means at this point on day 6, I can try the body of the sweater on, and I think it's actually at a point where I might not need to do any more of the pattern. I can move on to my ribbing. I'm going to do about 2.5 to 3 inches of ribbing at the hem. So with that plus blocking, I think the sweater might be long enough. One reason I'm confident about the length of this sweater is because of my gauge swatch. Because I swatched and then blocked that swatch, I have an idea of how much the fabric will grow, and I'm also knitting at a fairly loose gauge. If I were knitting at a much tighter gauge, creating an even more dense fabric, then maybe I wouldn't get too much more length in the blocking process, but because I've used this yarn, because I know I'm knitting kind of loosely still, I'm sure that I'll get at least an inch or two of length when I block this, and we'll look at the result at the end. Day 6 included our first concert of the week, and after the concert, we ended up having dinner at one of our favorite restaurants, and we had to wait for our table for about 45 minutes, so I threw the sweater over my shoulder and worked on the ribbing and was able to knock out that ribbing while we waited in line. So I always say no time is a bad time for knitting time, and that's what I mean. If you can pull your project out when you have unexpected wait time, maybe you can finish a portion of it or at least contribute to the project and feel really productive. So that's the end of day 6. All right, now for day 7. Day 7 started out with a Zoom session with my Patreon crew, and before anything like a social knitting or Zoom session where we're all going to be crafting and visiting, I like to make sure I have a project that will fit that sort of environment. Something I don't have to look at too much, something where I'm not having to stare too closely at a pattern because I want to be engaged, I want to be able to visit and take everything in without making mistakes and having to tear that project or that portion of the project back later. So before getting on Zoom, I picked up stitches for my first sleeve and I made sure to work enough of it that I was at a good point where I could join the Zoom and make progress on the project. I often try to make sure whatever I'm working on sort of lines up with the activities I have going on in my schedule that week. So I talked about starting a project. I like to cast on and make sure something is on the right foot before a travel day or before a meeting or any situation where I know I'm going to have knitting time, but maybe it's not the right situation to search things on the internet or go back to the yarn store or ask someone else for help. So I want to make sure that I'm self sufficient to at least start those projects. There are other times where you might have a lot of dedicated free time, and that's when I want to work on something where I get to follow the chart and I get to give almost all my attention to the project. Later in day 7, we spent a little bit more time at the pool and this time watching the sun set. So I continued to work on sleeve number 1, enjoying the sunset before we had to go to our next concert. And now for day 8. Day 8 is similar to another day in the week where I caught another sunrise. So this time I woke up even earlier and I drove partway up Mount Lemon. Mount Lemon in Tucson is absolutely beautiful. There's snow at the top, there's a ski resort, a couple of restaurants, and a lot of beautiful vistas along the way, along the drive. So I found a very cold boulder that I could sit on, and I set up my cameras and started to knit. I tried to film some of the video that didn't pan out. I used some of the footage in last week's video, but it was nice to be up there regardless. And I knew that. Sometimes when I'm somewhere really beautiful, I try to set up a camera and film something just because it's picturesque and it would be something nice to share, but it's more about me enjoying the moment and enjoying my project, enjoying the sunrise. So it's fine if something doesn't work out. If it does work out, then it's nice that I can share it. So this was one of those situations. I enjoyed working on more of the sleeve, watching the sunrise, staying out for as long as I could before my cadaver skin would start to fry up. And at least I have some good footage to share of a really beautiful morning from Mount Lemon. And at this point, I have to acknowledge that we've hit the 1 week mark. We've hit day 7, so I've been working on the sweater for a week, and I'm not finished. I'm partway through the first sleeve, and it will probably take at least a few more days to finish the first sleeve, the second sleeve, the ribbing at the collar, and then do the finishing work. Block the sweater, weave in ends, anything else that needs to happen before I can actually go out and enjoy the sweater. So I haven't made it in a week. I'll keep tracking the days, but I'll say that giving myself the goal of finishing it in a week kept me invested. It kept me focused on the project, and I think it was successful for me. I wasn't over knitting. I wasn't knitting to the point of fatigue. I was knitting as much as I enjoyed and as much as I wanted and could be knitting. So that's a wrap on day 7. We'll speed through the last few days and take a look at the finished sweater. I definitely said some of that wrong. We just covered day 8, so yes, I've exceeded the week either way. Now for the finishing of the sweater. Day 9 is another day with very little footage. This was our travel day home from Tucson, so I had guaranteed knitting time on the flights. Not much to film, but I finished my first sleeve and I got a good start on the second sleeve. On one of the flights, I think from Tucson to Chicago, we had two flight attendants in our section, Linda and Lynn. And I think Lynn was the knitter. So as soon as she saw me knitting, she came up and asked me about what I was making. She told me about her projects. And it's just one of my favorite things that when someone sees that you're crafting, and they identify it with it for some reason. Maybe they craft or someone close to them was a crafter, and then they have the confidence to say hello and make that connection. I think it's magical how much you share in that moment, how much you sort of feel and trust in one another just because of this shared craft, because of knitting or crocheting or whatever the hobby is. So I love moments like that, and they often happen when I travel. And I think a lot of you watching have experienced the same kind of thing. If you're crafting out in public in any sense, you probably get people who come up and say something about it, whether they're just admiring your work or they want to connect and kind of share a heartfelt moment. So that's definitely what happened with Lynn and Linda, talking about the project, getting to know each other, and feeling, I don't know, a real tangible sense of community. So, Lynn, if you're watching, hi. I love that. It made my day to meet you and get to share stories with each other about this craft that we love. So that's essentially it for day 9. Lots of time on the plane, some more time in the airport, finishing the first sleeve, getting a good start on the second sleeve, getting home, and resting. And for the final day of this project challenge, this speedy knitting challenge, I'll call it. Day 10 saw the finishing work of the sweater. I completed the second sleeve, did a little bit of ribbing around the neckline, and then I was able to do things like weave in my ends and block the sweater. So I did a full wet block. I'll show you the sweater before blocking and after blocking at the very end of the video. But for the blocking process, I did a full wet block as I usually do, soaking the sweater in room temperature, lukewarm water with a bit of wool wash and making sure I give it plenty of time to saturate fully before pressing the water out, laying it flat, and letting it dry. So here's the reveal. Here's the finished storm sweater with a little bit of commentary from me about how things turned out. First, we'll look at the pre-blocked sweater. So here I have it on. I'd say it's a little bit snug, a little bit clingy. It's also perhaps a little bit short. The sleeves are a little short. It's definitely not the fit I would want of a garment that I'm trying on at the store or something that I'm making for myself. So I'm sure, I know, I have faith that with blocking, I'll definitely get more size, more width, more length in this sweater. And now for the sweater, completely finished, completely dry. I think it maybe ended up a bit too big. I think I could have made one size down, could have saved myself maybe a day of knitting and gotten a little closer to finishing it in a week. Not that that's the important thing, but sometimes it's hard for me to know based on my swatch, based on how loose or how tight, how loose or how dense the fabric is. I don't always know how much something is going to block out, and I'm not aggressively blocking these things. I'm not stretching and pinning. I'm really just gathering the fabric, laying it flat, and then letting it dry. And depending on the fiber type, whether it's superwash wool, whether it's non-superwash wool, whether it has cotton or other fibers blended in, they all behave a bit differently. So I think this is just something I have to pay attention to, keep notes on, mention it in a video, put it somewhere where I'm going to remember so that when I work with these same fibers or same producers of yarn in the future, then I remember, okay, if I was working this fiber on this size needle with this type of stitch, it really blocks out, or it doesn't block out terribly. I think it's good for me to know when choosing the initial size. So here's the sweater completely finished. I think it could be maybe a size smaller, but I would rather it fit with a little bit of positive ease over being too tight. I wouldn't wear something if it was too tight or too small. It also, I think, is maybe a little long. This is all personal preference. You may look at it and think it's the perfect fit for me. Compared to other things I wear and other things I feel comfortable in, maybe it's just the slightest bit too long and the slightest bit too big. But overall, I'm really happy with it. It's very cozy, easy to wear, sort of sweatshirt, drapey, comfortable sweater. And here's a look close up at that texture, and I'm really happy with how it turned out, especially with this color. I think using this light color, it really shows the pattern. I think if I had used a darker color, it would still be a beautiful sweater, and I know a lot of Ganzis are dark. They're black, navy, deep red, yellow, all sorts, every color you can imagine. So it's not always about seeing the texture close up, but for my first Ganzi, I wanted to make one where I could really see that texture. And I think this pattern was easy to follow. I think it was well written. I didn't have any hiccups in the pattern. I did shorten the sleeves. I increased the rate of my decreasing, or the frequency of my decreasing, and didn't end up needing to use everything that was charted for the sleeves because I don't like a terribly long sleeve on myself. I also did a little adjusting to make it slightly less drop shoulder. I don't like the biggest drop shoulder ever, so it's still a drop shoulder sweater. It still looks like the pattern, but I made slight adjustments to get a fit that I know I prefer. Now for my final thoughts. Would I make this pattern again? Absolutely. I think I will make it again because I think Megan wants one, and as a thank you for all of the colors that she helps me choose, I think at this point I owe her a sweater. So maybe there'll be another one that I work on for Megan in the future. Would I try to make another sweater in a week's time or in 2 weeks' time? Yes, definitely. I think giving myself a goal, a realistic goal, helped push me. I think it kept me on task, it kept me focused, and it's something I would do again to achieve that same rate of success, I would call it. Do I think other people need to make a sweater in a week? No. I think if that's out of the realm for the speed at which you knit or craft, crochet, whatever you're making, then you don't need to give yourself an unrealistic goal. I think the idea is that you give yourself a goal or a benchmark that will make your crafting fun and focused. So for me, a week is maybe a little too fast to make a sweater, but if I gave myself the goal of 2 weeks and had specific benchmarks in place, then I think that's going to help me make my sweater. And I'm not going to make a sweater every 2 week period of my life because I don't need that many sweaters. I can't afford to make sweaters that quickly, but I like to knit in a focused time period, and then I take a break. I might be working on slower projects or smaller projects, things that are a little more tedious in other ways, and then I come back to the next sweater when I'm ready. So that's sort of my thoughts from every side of the conversation. And Gus and I will leave you with this. I don't think knitting should be a race, but sometimes I like the idea of racing myself. So, I'm not the fastest knitter out there, but I think I knit at a good pace, and it definitely keeps me motivated to give myself concrete goals. Make sure that I am sharing my work with others, whether I'm sharing it here on the channel, taking a picture of it and posting it to Instagram, putting my projects up on Ravelry, which I'm very bad at doing. All of those things help keep me accountable, and they make knitting more fun for me. They may not make knitting more fun for you, but there are probably things out there that you can identify that do make your crafting fun, fresh, and engaging. And that's what this is all about. So, thanks so much for coming along with me for this 10-day period, this stretched out week to follow the progress of this sweater. As always, I'm incredibly grateful for anyone who chooses to click on one of my videos and then watch and spend time with me. It means the world to me, and I have a lot of fun doing this. I've loved meeting so many of you, whether that's in person, whether it's over Zoom, whether it's through Patreon. So if you're interested in Zoom sessions, if you're interested in these social crafting days and evenings that I'm having, you can find out about that through Patreon, and the link is at the end of every video and always in the description box. So as always, thanks for choosing to spend this time with me today, and happy knitting, happy crocheting, happy crafting to you. Hopefully, we'll see you in the next one. Bye.